September 29, 1957, 4:20 p.m. local time. In a remote corner of the Soviet Urals, a storage tank for nuclear waste suddenly erupts. The explosion is estimated at 7,100 tons of TNT equivalent. A concrete lid weighing 160 tons is blown into the air and lands 25 meters away. A column of fire and radioactive debris rises nearly a kilometer high. For those who witness it from the nearby secret city of Chelyabinsk 40, the sky turns an unnatural orange. The blast is not nuclear, but it releases an estimated 20 million curies of radioactive material. That is roughly half the total release of Chernobyl. Yet within hours, the Soviet state will begin to erase this event from history. This is the Kyshtym disaster. The Mayak chemical combine, built in the late 1940s, was the Soviet Union's first plutonium production facility. Located about 100 kilometers northwest of Chelyabinsk, it was part of a secret industrial complex known as Chelyabinsk 40. The plant was a linchpin of the Soviet nuclear weapons program. By 1957, it had been operating for nearly a decade, producing weapons-grade plutonium under immense pressure. The facility included a radiochemical plant, a plutonium processing plant, and a massive storage facility for liquid high-level radioactive waste. The waste was stored in underground stainless steel tanks cooled by water jackets. One of these tanks, number 14, was the site of the explosion. The people working there were largely unaware of the danger. They were told the waste was safely contained. Warning signs had been accumulating for months. The cooling system for tank 14 had reportedly been malfunctioning. The nitrate acetate waste mixture was inherently unstable when dry. A loss of cooling could lead to a self-accelerating exothermic reaction. According to declassified documents, plant operators had noted rising temperatures in the tank, but dismissed them as instrumentation errors. The system lacked redundant safety features. There was no emergency plan for a waste tank explosion. The prevailing attitude was one of overconfidence. The Soviet nuclear program had achieved great successes. Accidents were considered unlikely. In the weeks before the explosion, the tank's internal temperature climbed steadily. Operators reportedly failed to report the anomaly up the chain. The design flaw was known. The tank had no backup cooling system. It was a disaster waiting to happen. The decision that made the disaster inevitable was the choice to store highly radioactive liquid waste in a single, non-redundant tank. After years of operation, the cooling system for tank 14 failed. By the time the failure was noticed, the waste had already begun to dry out and heat up. The decision to not install a backup cooling system was a cost-cutting measure. According to later investigations, the plant's management was aware of the risk but prioritized production quotas. The Soviet Union was in a race for nuclear supremacy. Delays were unacceptable. The tank's contents, a mixture of nitrate and acetate salts, became a chemical explosive when heated. On September 29th, the temperature inside the tank reached an estimated 330 degrees Celsius. The subsequent explosion was not nuclear, but chemical. It was a direct consequence of a systemic failure to prioritize safety over output. The explosion itself was a violent chemical reaction. The dried nitrate acetate salts detonated, shattering the 160-ton concrete lid and rupturing the tank. The blast wave destroyed nearby buildings and started fires. The radioactive plume rose to an altitude of about 1 kilometer and spread downwind. Over the next 10 to 12 hours, radioactive particles settled over an area stretching 300 kilometers to the northeast, creating what is now known as the East Urals radioactive trace. The contamination was not uniform. A narrow band of intense radiation, up to 100,000 curies per square kilometer in places. The Soviet military quickly sealed off the area, but the human cost was just beginning. If this story is new to you, subscribe. There are dozens more the world tried to forget. Immediate response was chaotic and secretive. Within hours, the Soviet Ministry of Internal Affairs established a cordon. The nearest city, Chelyabinsk 40, now Ozyorsk, was not evacuated for days. First responders, soldiers and plant workers were sent into the contaminated zone without protective gear. They were ordered to clear debris and cover the crater with soil. Many received lethal doses of radiation. According to later Soviet estimates, About 10,000 people were evacuated from the most heavily contaminated areas over the following weeks. But the evacuation was slow and incomplete. The Soviet government downplayed the scale of the disaster. No public announcement was made. The world would not learn of Kyshtym for nearly 2 decades. As the contamination spread, the full horror became clear. Radiation levels in some areas were so high that a person could receive a fatal dose in minutes. The East Urals radioactive trace eventually contaminated over 20,000 square kilometers. Hundreds of villages were affected. The Soviet government secretly established a sanitary protection zone, a forced exclusion zone. Residents were told nothing of the danger. Livestock died, crops withered, and people began to suffer from acute radiation sickness. But the official diagnosis was unknown illness. International alarm was slow to develop because the disaster was classified. It was only in 1976 that a Soviet defector, Boris Medvedev, revealed the truth to the West. The world was shocked to learn of a massive nuclear accident that had been hidden for nearly 20 years. The human cost was staggering. According to declassified Soviet documents, at least 200 people died from acute radiation syndrome in the first months. But the long-term toll is harder to quantify. Estimates suggest that thousands of people in the contaminated zone developed cancers over the following decades. The liquidators, those who cleaned up the disaster, were exposed to high doses. Many suffered from radiation sickness and died prematurely. The Soviet government provided medical care, but never acknowledged the cause. Villages were bulldozed and buried. The official death toll was kept secret. Even today, the exact number of victims remains disputed. According to environmental groups, the area around Mayak remains one of the most radioactive places on Earth. The disaster was not a single event. It was a slow, ongoing tragedy. The cover-up was systematic. The Soviet government immediately classified all information about the explosion. The city of Chelyabinsk 40 was removed from maps. The evacuated villages were erased. Residents were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. The disaster was not mentioned in Soviet media. Internally, the KGB investigated and punished some officials, but quietly. The plant manager was reportedly demoted, but no one faced public trial. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, was not informed. It was only after Medvedev's revelations and the subsequent pressure that the Soviet Union acknowledged the event, grudgingly, in 1989. By then, the full scope of the disaster was still hidden. The reckoning was incomplete. The cover-up had succeeded in keeping Kyshtym out of the global consciousness for decades. The legacy of Kyshtym is a cautionary tale about nuclear secrecy. The disaster led to some safety improvements in waste storage, but the fundamental issues of transparency and accountability remained. The Mayak plant continued operations and in later years suffered further accidents. The East Urals radioactive trace remains uninhabited, a permanent monument to the cost of nuclear ambition. The Kyshtym disaster is often called the forgotten Chernobyl, but it was worse in some ways. It was the first major nuclear waste accident, and it was hidden for decades. Today, the world faces similar challenges with nuclear waste storage. The lessons of Kyshtym are still relevant. If you want to understand the true cost of nuclear power, you need to remember the disasters that were erased. Subscribe to Nuclear Disasters for more stories the world tried to forget.